Hello and welcome back. Wherever you're listening from tonight, let yourself settle in fully. Let your shoulders drop an inch further into whatever is holding you up. Let your breathing slow, in through the nose, out long and easy, and let the day you've just finished get a little further away with every breath. Tonight, we're going looking for the real story behind something so ordinary most of us never think twice about it. A cold, sweet, softly melting treat that sits in nearly every freezer on the planet. Almost everything you've probably heard about where it came from turns out to be a story invented well after the fact, usually by someone trying to sell you more of it. The real history is quieter, stranger, and considerably more interesting, carrying us through ancient Persian ice towers, a Renaissance kitchen in Florence, a Philadelphia confectioner's shop, an 11-year-old boy's cold porch in Oakland, and a converted Navy barge somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. We'll take it slowly tonight, one small piece at a time, the way the treat itself is meant to be enjoyed. Right now, in this exact moment, somewhere on the far side of the planet where the sun is still high, someone is very likely holding a scoop of exactly this same treat, entirely unaware of the specific 8,000-mile, several thousand-year journey that particular pleasure actually traveled to reach them. That's genuinely worth sitting with for a moment before we begin. That something this small and this ordinary carries this much accumulated human history quietly folded inside it every single time. You don't need to remember any of it. Let your eyes rest closed. Let your breathing slow further still. There's nothing to solve tonight, only a long, cool drift through a history considerably richer than any of the comfortable myths surrounding it. Let's begin the way it actually began, long before refrigeration existed in any form at all. Ancient Persian engineers had already solved the basic problem of keeping ice frozen through a brutal desert summer, and their solution still stands in parts of Iran today. Structures called yakshals, tall cone-shaped towers built from a special heat-resistant mud brick, used thick insulating walls and a clever underground channel system to keep winter ice solid for months at a time, some capable of storing enough ice to last an entire wealthy household through the hottest stretch of the year. Ice harvested from nearby mountains during winter was carried down and packed inside, sometimes layered with straw for extra insulation. The oldest confirmed yakshals date back to at least 400 BCE, meaning Persian engineers were successfully defeating a desert summer using nothing but clever architecture roughly 24 centuries before anyone had a mechanical freezer to do the job instead. Getting that ice down from the mountains in the first place was its own considerable undertaking, worth picturing for a moment before we move on. Ice cut from mountain slopes during winter had to travel, often for days, along overland routes to reach the yakshaw waiting for it, carried by mule or ox cart, packed carefully enough that a meaningful portion still survived the journey intact. Persian engineers paired this transport network with a genuinely elegant secondary trick, channeling shallow pools of water past the yakshaw's shaded northern wall on clear winter nights, where the exposed water would radiate its own heat upward into the cold night sky and freeze solid even without snowfall, adding directly to the tower's stored supply. It's a technique called radiative cooling, rediscovered independently by modern physicists centuries later, and Persian builders were already relying on it as ordinary, practical knowledge. Once ice was reliably available, Persian nobility put it to a genuinely pleasurable use, mixing shaved or crushed ice with fruit juices, rosewater, and saffron to create a chilled, fragrant treat historians generally consider one of the earliest direct ancestors of what we'd recognize today as a sorbet. It's worth being precise about an important distinction here, since it'll matter again and again tonight. This was flavored ice, not ice cream. No dairy, no cream, none of the rich, smooth texture the word conjures up today. Still, the basic pleasure at the center of it, cold and sweet together on the tongue, was already fully understood in Persia well over 2,000 years before anyone in Europe had anything comparable of their own to offer. Roman emperors, Nero among them, are genuinely documented sending runners into the mountains to fetch snow, which was then mixed with honey and fruit to create a similarly chilled treat enjoyed at the imperial table. It's worth knowing this one because it occupies a strange, honest middle ground in tonight's story, a popular claim that's neither pure myth nor quite what it's usually made out to be. The snow and honey mixture was real. Calling it ice cream, though, requires stretching the definition well past where the evidence can actually support it, since it still contained no dairy whatsoever. Nero's dessert deserves genuine credit as an early ancestor of the modern snow cone. It simply isn't the origin story it's frequently dressed up to be. Getting that snow to the imperial table at all required its own considerable logistical effort, worth picturing for a moment. Relay teams of runners carried sealed containers of mountain snow down toward Rome in organized stages, each runner covering a set stretch before handing off to the next, racing against the same basic enemy. Every single frozen treat in tonight's story has always had to outrun ordinary heat, slowly, patiently melting away whatever advantage ahead start in the cold mountains had briefly provided. In China, sometime during the Tang Dynasty, between 618 and 907 CE, cooks began experimenting with something considerably closer to true ice cream, mixing milk with rice and packing the mixture into snow until it froze solid. This represents a genuinely significant step beyond Persia's flavored ice, since it actually involved dairy, the missing ingredient that separates a snow cone from something we'd recognize today as ice cream's true ancestor. Chinese cooks of this same broad era are also credited with a separate, remarkably useful discovery: that dissolving saltpeter in water lowers the water's freezing point, creating genuine artificial cold without needing any natural snow or ice on hand at all. It's a discovery that would prove essential centuries later, once Europeans finally worked out the same basic trick for themselves. Tang court poetry from this same period occasionally makes passing reference to iced delicacies served at imperial banquets, though, much like Rome's own snow and honey tradition, the surviving descriptions are frustratingly brief, more a passing detail in a longer poem than any kind of careful culinary record. What we can say with real confidence is narrower than the popular imagination usually assumes. Real dairy, real snow, and a real appetite for the combination, all present in China many centuries before Europe managed the same thing. But no complete recipe, no named inventor, nothing beyond fragments. It's a pattern worth noticing early, since we'll meet it again and again tonight. Real evidence for something genuinely remarkable sitting right alongside real uncertainty about exactly how it was made or by whom. The Arab world developed its own considerable expertise in chilled, flavored drinks during this same broad period, producing sharab, a sweetened fruit beverage, and eventually sharbat, snow or ice carried down from nearby mountains and flavored with fruit syrup, rosewater, and crushed pistachios. This single Arabic word eventually traveled into English by way of several intermediate languages, giving us both sherbet and, through a related path, syrup. a small linguistic fossil confirming exactly how directly this Arab tradition fed into everything Europe would eventually inherit. Arab traders and scholars maintained close, ongoing contact with the Byzantine world, and crucially, with Sicily, which fell under Islamic rule between 965 and 1072 CE. It's within exactly this contact zone, Islamic Sicily, considerably more than any single explorer's dramatic personal journey, that most careful historians now believe frozen dessert knowledge actually made its way into Europe. And that raises a question worth sitting with for a moment, since you've almost certainly heard a very different, much more famous version of how frozen treats reached the West. If the real bridge into Europe was a quiet, centuries-long trade relationship between Sicily and the Arab world, why does nearly everyone instead credit one single, dramatic traveler arriving home from China with a secret in his luggage? That same Sharbat tradition traveled well beyond Sicily and the Mediterranean. Worth a brief detour before we turn to Europe's own confused reception of it. Mughal emperors ruling across India from the 1500 onward maintained elaborate relay systems, specifically to carry ice down from distant Himalayan foothills to their own royal kitchens, mixing it with fruit, rosewater, and saffron, in a tradition directly descended from the same Persian and Arab sherbet culture we've already traced tonight. A genuinely enormous logistical undertaking, mounted purely in service of a chilled, sweet drink. It's worth noticing how consistently this same basic pattern repeats itself. Wealthy rulers across entirely disconnected regions, independently deciding that cold, sweet refreshment was worth genuinely serious engineering effort to obtain. You've almost certainly heard that Marco Polo brought ice cream back to Italy from China, having tasted it during his famous 13th century travels. It's one of the most repeated facts about ice cream in popular culture, and it has no genuine historical support at all. Polo's own detailed written account of his travels never once mentions ice cream, frozen desserts, or any comparable Chinese technique. A genuinely significant silence for a traveler otherwise remarkably attentive to unfamiliar food. Historian Francis Wood, who has specifically studied the reliability of Polo's broader account, has noted this silence as one of several real inconsistencies worth taking seriously. If Polo had truly encountered something this memorable, it would be a strange thing for him to simply leave out. One further possibility legend connects directly back to that same Marco Polo myth. Some versions claim the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, who ruled China during the period of Polo's supposed visit, kept the secret of frozen dairy treats closely guarded within his royal court for generations, permitting it to reach Europe only once Polo somehow gained special access to the recipe. This particular embellishment appears nowhere in any genuine historical record from the period, and most careful historians treat it as a later narrative flourish. One confident, invented detail quietly stacked directly on top of another. What's actually documented about Kublai Khan's court through surviving Chinese sources rather than through Polo's own writing is that it genuinely did enjoy a chilled dairy treat, sometimes described as milk ice, likely made using fermented mare's milk combined with flour and ice, reflecting the Mongol court's own distinct culinary traditions, blended with techniques inherited from the earlier Tang Dynasty. That treat was real. The secret Polo supposedly stole simply never was. Robert Brantley, a researcher at Colonial Williamsburg, who has spent considerable time tracing ice cream's actual documented history, points to something worth knowing plainly. The Marco Polo story, along with several others we'll encounter tonight, appears to have been actively created and popularized during the 1800 by American and European ice cream sellers, who found a tale of ancient imperial discovery to be considerably better marketing than the messier, harder to summarize truth. It's a pattern we'll meet more than once tonight. Storytelling assembled well after the fact, specifically to sell a product, rather than storytelling that grew organically from anything that actually happened. Knowing who benefited from a story spreading often tells you more about it than the story itself does. Catherine de' Medici, the Italian noblewoman who married the future King Henry II of France in 1533, is often credited with personally introducing ice cream to the French court, supposedly bringing a team of skilled Italian chefs along with her. This particular claim runs into a genuinely fatal timing problem. The earliest confirmed French recipes for anything resembling true ice cream don't appear until well over a century after Catherine's marriage, and detailed historical research by Caroline Lidl and Robin Weir, published in their considered study Ices, the definitive guide, found no documentary evidence she brought any Italian culinary staff with her at all, let let alone ones skilled in a technique that, as far as the surviving record shows, hadn't even been developed anywhere in Italy. Yet it's worth understanding exactly why this particular myth proved so durable despite the timing problem. Since the Medici family genuinely did host some of Renaissance Europe's most celebrated banquets, elaborate multi-course affairs featuring genuinely spectacular sugar sculptures and confections that impressed foreign visitors enough to write home about them. Catherine's real, documented association with lavish, sophisticated dining made her a plausible-sounding candidate for nearly any culinary innovation later storytellers wanted a famous name attached to, whether or not the specific timeline actually supported the claim. England's King Charles I supposedly paid his personal ice cream chef, sometimes named DeMurco in the story, a substantial annual pension, specifically to keep the recipe a closely guarded royal secret, only for it to slip out following the king's execution in 1649. It's a genuinely vivid, dramatic tale, and according to Liddell and Weir's careful research, it appears to have no historical basis whatsoever, no surviving royal payment record, no contemporary account, nothing beyond the story itself, repeated confidently enough, for long enough, that it eventually came to feel true. It joins Marco Polo and Catherine de' Medici in the same quiet category, a genuinely good story that simply never happened. It's worth noticing exactly what kind of research it actually takes to responsibly rule a story like this out, since disproving a negative is always harder than repeating a positive claim. Liddell and Weir's work involved combing carefully through surviving royal household account ledgers, the kind of dry, exhaustive financial record that meticulously tracked far smaller and considerably less dramatic 17th century royal expenses than a supposedly generous secret pension would have represented. No such payment appears anywhere in that surviving paperwork, and for a monarchy that documented its spending this thoroughly, that absence carries real, genuine weight. It's worth pausing on why these particular stories took hold so effectively, since the pattern says something useful about how history sometimes gets casually written by the people selling it, rather than the people carefully researching it. Each myth attaches ice cream to something already impressive and recognizable: imperial Rome, the legendary Marco Polo, a French queen, a beheaded English king, borrowing an existing story's drama to make an uncertain, patchwork history feel considerably more complete than it actually was. None of the real documented history is boring. It simply requires patience and a willingness to say plainly when the record runs out, rather than filling every gap with whichever story happens to sound best. There's also a simple commercial logic worth naming plainly, since it explains why these particular myths, rather than some other set entirely, are the ones that actually survived into the present day. A parlor owner advertising the ancient secret of Marco Polo was selling mystery and pedigree alongside the dessert itself, a considerably more compelling pitch to a curious 19th century customer than we're honestly not entirely sure who first thought of this. Myths that flattered a product tended to get repeated in advertisements and reprinted in cookbooks. Myths that simply admitted uncertainty rarely made it onto anyone's storefront window at all. So what does the real, honestly documented history actually show? The first genuinely confirmed recipes for true dairy-based ice cream begin appearing in Europe sometime in the mid to late 1600, considerably later than any popular myth suggests, and considerably more gradually, without any single dramatic moment we can point to with confidence. Italian confectioners are generally credited with the earliest documented sophistication in this particular craft, building on inherited Arab sherbet traditions and the broader Mediterranean culture of flavored ices that had already been developing for centuries. Popular tradition sometimes credits a Florentine confectioner named Bernardo Buontalenti with a breakthrough recipe in the 1500. Though it's worth being honest that this specific attribution rests on considerably thinner documentary evidence than its confident retelling usually suggests. Italy's confectionery trade during this period operated through organized craft guilds, much like most other skilled professions of the era, and these guilds guarded their members' specific techniques with real, deliberate secrecy, sharing improvements only among trusted fellow guild members, rather than publishing them openly for any curious outsider to read. It's a genuinely important part of why so little detailed documentation survives from ice cream's actual earliest dairy-based decades. Not because nobody was practicing the craft skillfully, but because the people who understood it best had every professional incentive to keep exactly how they did it to themselves. The single most important technical breakthrough in this entire story deserves real, careful attention. since it's what actually made reliable ice cream production possible in the first place. European experimenters in the late 1500 and early 1600s discovered, likely rediscovering knowledge Chinese cooks had already worked out centuries earlier, that mixing salt into ice dramatically lowers the temperature the ice can maintain. Salt disrupts ice's ability to remain a stable solid at its normal freezing point, forcing some of it to melt even in cold conditions. And that melting absorbs a considerable amount of heat energy from its surroundings, pulling the temperature of the mixture down dramatically, sometimes well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It's genuinely elegant, simple chemistry, and it changed absolutely everything about what was actually possible. It's worth sitting with what that moment of discovery would have actually felt like for whoever first tried it. Ice, already cold, was already understood as roughly cold as cold got, a fixed, familiar limit. Adding ordinary table salt and watching the mixture grow noticeably, almost impossibly colder still, would have genuinely defied whatever intuitive sense of temperature that person had built up across an entire lifetime. Cold behaving in a way cold simply wasn't supposed to behave. It's exactly the kind of quiet, private aha moment easy to walk past in a history book, but it's worth actually pausing on, since the rest of tonight's entire story is really just an elaboration on that one specific, startling discovery. Before this discovery, anyone wanting a frozen treat needed direct access to genuine snow or harvested ice, tying frozen desserts to specific seasons and specific climates. Once confectioners understood that ordinary ice and ordinary salt could produce genuine artificial cold on demand, ice cream became something that could, in principle, be made anywhere a cook had access to both ingredients, regardless of season. A considered 1,692 recipe collection published in France by confectioner Nicolas Audige documents exactly this technique in careful, practical detail. Packing salt and pounded ice around a smaller container of sweetened cream and stirring the inner mixture regularly to prevent large ice crystals from forming as it gradually froze. With reliable artificial freezing finally understood, ice cream began spreading through European society considerably faster than before. In Paris, a Sicilian confectioner named Francesco Procopio de Caltielli opened a cafe in 1686 called the Café Procope, still operating today as one of the oldest continuously running restaurants in the world. Among its considerable draws was a genuinely wide selection of flavored ices and creams, served to a fashionable Parisian clientele eager for exactly this kind of refined, novel refreshment. It represents one of the first well-documented instances of frozen dessert offered as a specific, regular commercial product, rather than only prepared privately within a single wealthy household's kitchen. The cafe became, well beyond its ice cream alone, a genuine gathering place for some of the era's most notable writers and thinkers. Voltaire reportedly among its regular patrons, its marble tables hosting the kind of long, unhurried philosophical conversation the coffeehouse tradition more broadly was becoming known for across Enlightenment era Paris. Ice cream's earliest genuine commercial home, in other words, wasn't a simple sweet shop at all, but one of the intellectual centers of its entire city. Cold dessert and serious conversation sharing the very same marble tabletop. Benjamin Franklin, serving as an American diplomat in Paris during the late 1770 and 1780, is documented as a regular customer at this very same cafe, and surviving accounts suggest he genuinely enjoyed the ice cream served there among the city's fashionable intellectual set. It's a small, pleasant detail worth holding onto that decades before another founding figure brought his own recipe home from France. Franklin had already been quietly enjoying the same basic pleasure at the very cafe where European ice cream culture had first properly taken root a century earlier. Café Procope's success didn't stay confined to Paris for long. Similar establishments opened across the following decades in Vienna, London, and eventually across most of Europe's major capitals, each one adapting the same basic formula: flavored ices and creams served in a genuinely fashionable public setting to its own local tastes and ingredients. London's own ice cream shops, clustered particularly around the city's more prosperous neighborhoods by the mid-1700, helped fuel exactly the kind of widespread cookbook demand HANA Glass's own collection would soon meet. It's worth noticing how directly commercial availability and written recipe knowledge fed each other during this period. Each new cafe creating more curious customers, and each new customer creating more demand for someone to finally write the technique down clearly enough for an ordinary household to attempt it themselves. It's worth returning briefly to Florence, since although Catherine de Medici's personal connection to ice cream turned out to be fictional, the broader Medici family did, in genuine documented fact, take a considerable scientific interest in cold and freezing during the following century. The Accademia del Cimiento, a pioneering scientific academy founded in Florence in 1657 under the patronage of Cosimo II, de Medici's own descendants, conducted careful, methodical experiments studying how different mixtures of salt, ice, and various chemical compounds affected achievable temperatures. It's a genuinely fitting correction that the real Medici connection to ice cream isn't a queen bringing chefs to France, but an entire scientific academy patiently measuring exactly how cold a mixture of salt and ice could actually get. England developed its own considerable enthusiasm for ice cream across the 1700, with recipes appearing in increasingly widely circulated cookbooks, including H.A.N.A. Glass's influential 1751 collection, which included detailed instructions for both the freezing technique itself and a genuinely wide range of specific flavors. By this point, ice cream making had become sophisticated and widely enough understood to warrant detailed written instruction for an ordinary literate household cook, rather than remaining closely guarded knowledge confined to a small handful of specialized royal confectioners. English ice cream of this period was frequently molded into elaborate decorative shapes, using specially designed pewter molds, forming the frozen dessert into fruits, animals, or architectural forms before presenting it at the table. A genuinely theatrical piece of dinner party showmanship. The pineapple mold specifically deserves a moment of its own, since the fruit it imitated was, during this exact period, an almost impossibly expensive luxury import in England, so costly that wealthy households sometimes rented a single real pineapple purely for table display rather than actually eating it. Serving a molded ice cream shaped convincingly like one, let a host offer guests the fruit's genuine visual prestige without the genuinely prohibitive expense. A clever piece of edible theater built specifically around the gap between what a household could afford to display and what it could actually afford to serve. Founding era American figures documented their own genuine enthusiasm for ice cream in surviving records. Thomas Jefferson, during his years as an American diplomat in France, developed a real appreciation for French-style ice cream and brought recipes back with him, including a detailed 18-step vanilla ice cream recipe preserved in his own handwriting, held today at the Library of Congress. It describes a painstaking process of preparing a custard base, freezing it in a pewter container packed with ice and salt, and periodically scraping the frozen mixture from the container's sides to keep it smooth rather than letting it freeze into one solid, unusable block. George Washington, for his part, is documented purchasing a cream machine for ice in 1784, and household records from Mount Vernon confirm ice cream was regularly served to guests during warmer months. But consider for a moment what actually stood behind that pleasant summer dessert reaching the table at all. Making ice cream during this entire period remained genuinely demanding physical labor, regardless of how wealthy the household commissioning it happened to be. Someone needed to pack and repack ice and salt around the freezing container. Someone needed to turn or shake it repeatedly, and someone needed to scrape the increasingly frozen mixture from its sides at regular intervals, all while working quickly enough that the ice itself didn't melt away before the cream had fully frozen. This labor, in wealthy households across Europe and the American colonies alike, fell overwhelmingly to servants and enslaved people, whose names, in the vast majority of surviving records, were never bothered to be written down at all, even as their employers' own enthusiastic enjoyment of the finished product was carefully documented and preserved for historians centuries later to find. One of those laborers eventually stepped out from behind that same historical silence and into considerable recognition of his own, though it took him building an entirely independent business to manage it. Augustus Jackson was born free in Philadelphia in 1808, and at just 9 years old began working as a chef within the White House kitchen, serving under Presidents James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson across 2 full decades, from 1817 until 1837. It was almost certainly during these years, surrounded by the considerable culinary demands of formal state dinners, that Jackson developed the deep practical expertise in dessert making that would eventually define the rest of his career. In 1837, Jackson returned to his native Philadelphia and opened his own catering and confectionery business, developing what would become known as Philadelphia-style ice cream, a genuinely significant refinement over the egg-heavy custard bases most ice cream of the era relied on. His recipes were largely eggless, producing a lighter, cleaner result, and he further refined the salt and ice freezing technique to reduce both the cost and labor required for a genuinely smooth product. Rather than guard this knowledge as a competitive secret, Jackson packaged his ice cream in metal tins and sold it wholesale to other Black-owned ice cream parlors across Philadelphia, sharing his improved techniques openly with a small community of fellow Black confectioners, rather than trying to maintain exclusive control over what he'd developed. Jackson is remembered specifically for developing a genuinely wide range of original flavors, well beyond simple vanilla and chocolate, including strawberry, lemon, and pistachio recipes, considered notably sophisticated for their era. Though none of his original written recipes survive today, several food historians studying Philadelphia's 19th century confectionery trade have suggested his eggless technique and careful flavor balancing directly influenced the broader Philadelphia-style ice cream that remained a recognized regional specialty for well over a century after his own death. By the time of his death in 1852, Augustus Jackson had become one of the wealthiest Black entrepreneurs in Philadelphia, and he's remembered today somewhat informally, but with genuine affection, as the father of ice cream, a title no single person can honestly claim in any literal sense, but one that in Jackson's specific case points toward a real, well-documented contribution rather than a 19th century marketing invention. No surviving patent or formally recorded document preserves his specific techniques in his own words, a gap some later researchers have connected to the genuinely difficult legal and social barriers Black inventors faced when attempting to secure formal intellectual property protection during this period, though the precise reason for the absence isn't fully documented either way, and deserves the same honest caution as everything else tonight. It's worth understanding just how meaningful Jackson's choice to share his techniques openly actually was, given the world he was building his business inside. Philadelphia, in the decades before the Civil War, held one of the largest free black populations of any American city, and its black community had already developed its own considerable network of independent businesses, churches, and mutual aid societies operating within a country that offered them, at every turn, only a fraction of the legal and economic protection it extended automatically to white entrepreneurs doing exactly the same work. Jackson's decision to sell his improved technique wholesale to other black-owned parlors, rather than guard it as his own private advantage, helped strengthen that entire surrounding community's economic footing. One tin of eggless ice cream at a time. Just under a decade after Jackson's death, a considerably more mechanical breakthrough arrived that would do more than almost anything else to finally bring ice cream within reach of ordinary households. On September 9th, 1843, Nancy Maria Donaldson Johnson, a Philadelphia inventor, was awarded United States Patent Number 254 for what she called an artificial freezer. Johnson's design used a wooden tub packed with ice and salt surrounding an inner metal canister holding the cream mixture. But her genuinely significant innovation was a hand-cranked mechanism turning a curved internal beater, called a dasher, continuously scraping the freezing mixture from the canister's inner walls while simultaneously mixing air into it, producing a smoother, lighter result, considerably faster than the earlier method of periodic manual scraping ever managed. Remarkably little is documented about Nancy Johnson's own personal life beyond her patent record. Born in New York State in 1794, married to scientist Walter Rogers Johnson, and eventually forced by financial circumstance to sell her patent rights outright for a mere $200, never personally profiting from an invention that would go on to genuinely transform an entire industry. It's a familiar, quietly frustrating pattern, worth naming honestly, that Johnson secured formal legal recognition for her invention. A genuine achievement for any woman inventor navigating the considerable barriers of 1840's America, and still saw remarkably little of the wealth it eventually generated for the people who purchased and commercialized it after her. Once Johnson's basic principle became public knowledge, a genuine wave of competing patents followed within just a few years. Other inventors filing their own variations on the same essential mechanism, different gear ratios, different canister shapes, different crank designs, each one claiming some modest improvement over what had come before. Few of these later patents achieved anything close to Johnson's own lasting influence, and fewer still are remembered by name today. But their sheer number says something worth noting about how quickly a genuinely good idea, once it exists in the world at all, tends to attract imitators looking for their own small piece of it. Johnson's hand-cranked design, once its patent had changed hands, spread rapidly, since it required no specialized industrial equipment to build or operate, only wood, metal, and a person willing to turn the crank. Picture the actual physical experience of using one. A household cook feeling the resistance gradually increase as the mixture inside slowly thickened. The cold radiating outward through the wood, hands growing numb despite the tub's considerable insulation. The whole process taking anywhere from 20 minutes to nearly an hour. It was genuinely hard, cold, repetitive work, considerably less romantic than the finished bowl of smooth ice cream eventually presented at the table might suggest. But it finally allowed a genuinely wide range of American families, not merely the wealthy, to make reasonably consistent ice cream in their own kitchens. The final piece needed to transform ice cream from a homemade treat into a genuine mass-market industry arrived in 1851 when a Baltimore milk dealer named Jacob Fussell, searching for a reliable way to use surplus cream his dairy business was otherwise struggling to sell profitably, opened what's generally considered the first true wholesale ice cream manufacturing operation in the United States. Fussell's genuine innovation wasn't primarily technical, but organizational and economic, producing ice cream in large, standardized batches specifically to sell at wholesale prices to retailers, rather than the smaller, more expensive batches confectioners like Jackson had produced. This shift in scale mattered enormously, since it meant ice cream's price could finally drop low enough to reach genuinely working-class customers. Fussell's basic model spread quickly to other American cities across the following decades. Other dairy operators, recognizing the same underlying opportunity, using surplus cream that might otherwise spoil unsold to produce a genuinely profitable secondary product at real commercial scale. By the century's final decades, wholesale ice cream manufacturing had become a genuinely competitive industry in its own right, with dozens of regional producers vying for the same expanding market. each one in its own particular way, chasing the same basic goal Fussell had first proven possible, turning what had briefly been a genuine waste problem into one of the young country's most reliably profitable food industries. Before ice cream could become genuinely ordinary and widely available, someone first had to solve a considerably more basic problem, reliably getting natural ice itself to places that didn't have any, in large enough quantities to actually matter. But how do you convince an entire skeptical shipping industry that hauling frozen water across the tropics is anything but a fool's errand? A Boston businessman named Frederick Teodor took on exactly this challenge beginning in 1806, when he first attempted to ship New England pond ice harvested during winter and packed carefully in sawdust for insulation to the considerably warmer Caribbean island of Martinique, an idea most of his own contemporaries considered genuinely absurd, since a large portion of his very first shipment simply melted away entirely before it could ever be sold. Tudor persisted despite this expensive early failure, gradually refining his insulation techniques over the following years. By the 1830 and 40, Tudor had built a genuinely substantial international trade, shipping New England ice as far as Calcutta, India, a journey of many months across open ocean, arriving with a meaningful portion of the original cargo still frozen solid enough to sell. His growing trade directly enabled ice cream's own continued spread throughout America, since reliable, affordable commercial ice supply was the single essential ingredient every other part of the process still depended on. Harvesting this ice was itself difficult, dangerous seasonal labor. Workers using large hand saws to carve enormous blocks directly from frozen lake surfaces during the coldest months of winter, hauling each block onto sledges and storing them in massive, heavily insulated ice houses, capable of keeping the harvest frozen well into the following summer. The writer Henry David Thoreau, living beside Walden Pond in Massachusetts during the 1840, directly witnessed and documented the same ice harvesting industry Tudor's earlier success had helped establish, describing in his own journal the considerable spectacle of workers cutting enormous blocks of ice from the pond's frozen surface, the blocks eventually destined, he noted with some genuine wonder, for destinations as far away as India. Picture the actual physical experience of that harvest for a moment. Teams moving across the frozen lake in careful, coordinated lines. Hand saws scoring uniform blocks. Hooks and poles guiding each heavy block toward shore, cold, physically demanding, occasionally dangerous work performed outdoors through the coldest weeks of winter, all so that a considerably warmer season and a considerably more comfortable household somewhere else entirely could eventually enjoy a genuinely simple pleasure. Tudor, who became known in his own lifetime as the Ice King, eventually built a genuinely considerable fortune from what had originally struck nearly everyone around him as an obviously foolish idea. It's one more example of a pattern worth noticing by this point in tonight's journey, that the parts of history most worth remembering aren't always the parts that end up getting remembered. A Boston ice merchant's stubborn, initially disastrous shipping venture turns out to matter considerably more to ice cream's own 19th century history than any of the confident, dramatic myths we spent the earlier part of tonight carefully setting aside. Tudor's trade reshaped considerably more of daily American life than ice cream alone. Worth pausing on briefly, since it's easy to lose sight of amid tonight's more dessert-focused story. Once reliable commercial ice supply reached a given city, entire new categories of business became suddenly possible around it. Breweries able to keep beer cold through summer months. Butchers able to preserve meat considerably longer. Households able to maintain a proper icebox for the very first time. Ice cream's own mid-century boom, in other words, rode directly alongside a much broader transformation in how ordinary American families managed food and freshness, one considerably larger than any single dessert could take credit for on its own. Once ice cream became genuinely accessible, an entirely new kind of institution grew up around it. Delmonico's, a celebrated New York restaurant that opened in 1837, quickly became legendary among the city's wealthiest and most fashionable residents, serving elaborate, carefully molded ice cream creations as a regular feature of its dessert offerings. This helped establish ice cream's place as a genuinely respectable, even prestigious course within formal fine dining, rather than only a casual treat enjoyed on a summer afternoon. At Delmonico's, Chef Charles Ron-Ofer created one of ice cream's more theatrical presentations in 1867, a dessert combining ice cream with meringue. Briefly baked baked at high heat, so the outer layer browned, while the ice cream inside remained fully frozen. He named it Baked Alaska, timed deliberately to celebrate the United States' recent purchase of the Alaska Territory. That same year, the dish became an instant sensation, specifically because it seemed to defy basic kitchen logic. A genuinely hot dessert with a genuinely frozen center, achieved through nothing more exotic than meringue's excellent natural insulating properties. Restaurants and confectioners across other major American cities followed Delmonico's lead throughout the following decades. And by the century's final years, a proper ice cream parlor with marble counters and an extensive menu of flavors had become a genuine fixture of American urban social life. One of the most beloved frozen treats in American history began, according to the treat's own official origin story, with an 11-year-old boy's simple mistake on a cold night in 1905. Frank E. Pierson, living in the San Francisco Bay Area, had mixed himself a soda drink from powdered flavoring and water, leaving the glass out on the porch overnight with the wooden stirring stick still standing in it. It's worth being honest that this particular story, charming as it is difficult to independently verify, and food historians generally treat it as the company's own cherished account rather than a fully documented historical fact. Still, it's the story that survives, and it's a genuinely good one. That particular night turned unusually cold, and when young Epperson found his glass the next morning, the sugary drink had frozen completely solid around the stick. Curious, he ran the glass under warm water, slid the frozen treat free, and used the stick as a handle to eat it, discovering, quite by accident, something genuinely delicious. He named his invention an epicicle, combining his own last name with the word icicle, and began making them for his friends around the neighborhood, a habit he apparently carried into adulthood, later making the same treat for his own children. Epperson didn't act on his childhood discovery commercially for nearly 2 decades. In the early 1920s, he began selling his epsicles at Neptune Beach, an amusement park in Alameda, California, nicknamed the West Coast Kenai Island, where the treat reportedly sold as many as 8,000 servings in a single day. Encouraged by this success, Epperson finally filed a patent in June of 1924, describing his invention as a frozen confection of attractive appearance, which can be conveniently consumed without contamination by contact with the hand. His own children, by this point, had taken to calling the treat popsicle, and the name stuck permanently, gradually shortening into the word we still use today. Epperson eventually sold the rights to his invention to the Joe Low Company, and it was this company that turned the popsicle into a genuine nationwide sensation, eventually developing the beloved double-stick version during the Great Depression, allowing two children to share a single treat for the same 5-cent price. The popsicle brand spent years locked in legal disputes with a close commercial rival built on almost exactly the same basic idea, a chocolate-coated treat on a stick, before the two companies eventually reached a compromise, allowing each to sell its own particular style of frozen novelty without further legal conflict. It's worth returning briefly to Epperson's own later life, since the story doesn't quite end with his 1924 patent. Epperson continued working in the frozen treat business for years afterward, and by most accounts lived to see his childhood accident become one of the most beloved treats in American history, selling in the billions annually by the time of his death in 1983. It's a genuinely satisfying kind of ending, an 11-year-old's simple mistake on a cold porch, eventually becoming something an entire country, and eventually much of the world, would come to recognize instantly by shape alone. Two flat wooden sticks pressed into brightly colored ice. The popsicle brand kept finding small, clever ways to hold its own place in American childhood long after its Depression-era double-stick innovation. Later decades saw the sticks themselves printed with jokes, riddles, and trivia questions, a small reward built directly into finishing the treat, and the company steadily expanded its flavor lineup and shapes across the mid-20th century, from simple fruit-flavored bars into an entire colorful category of its own. It's a genuinely fitting afterlife for something that began, quite literally, as an accident nobody planned, an entire branded product line quietly built, one patient decade at a time, on top of a single cold California night. That rival deserves its own considerable attention tonight, since its own origin story is every bit as charming as Epperson's. In Youngstown, Ohio, in January of 1920, confectioner Harry Burt was working late in his ice cream parlor alongside his adult children, Ruth and Harry Jr., having just perfected a smooth chocolate coating specifically designed to properly adhere to a solid block of ice cream. Ruth was the first to try it, and her verdict, according to the family's own later account, was straightforward, delicious, but far too messy to actually eat without making a genuine mess of her hands. It's a wonderfully ordinary problem for a genuinely clever solution to eventually solve. Harry Jr., glancing at a tray of the family's existing Jolly Boy lollipops nearby, suggested a simple fix: freezing one of the same wooden sticks directly into the ice cream itself, giving the whole treat a convenient handle. The idea worked immediately, the stick bonding securely to the frozen ice cream once it hardened. Bert named his new creation the Good Humor Bar, based on an old, genuinely sincere belief that a person's temperament or humor was closely connected to the humor or sense of their own palate. When Bert applied for a patent in January of 1922, the office initially rejected it, considering it too similar to an already existing chocolate-coated treat called the Eskimo pie, and Bert's son reportedly had to travel to Washington, D.C. with an actual pail of Good Humor bars to demonstrate the genuine difference in person before the patent was finally granted the following year. Harry Bert's Good Humor Bar and Frank E. Pearson's Popsicle weren't the only frozen treats racing toward a patent office during this same remarkably inventive stretch of the early 1920s. In Onahwa, Iowa, a candy store owner named Christian Nelson had, around 1920 or 1921, been separately experimenting with his own method for coating a bar of ice cream in chocolate. After a young customer reportedly couldn't decide whether he wanted candy or ice cream, and asked, half-jokingly, for both at once, Nelson's own invention, eventually named the Eskimo pie, became genuinely, enormously popular within just a couple of years, and its close similarity to Bert's own Good Humor Bar led directly to the patent dispute already mentioned. Two confectioners in entirely different states, working on essentially the same basic idea at essentially the same moment, without either one having any knowledge the other existed. It's worth knowing plainly that this original name didn't survive unquestioned forever. The manufacturer formally renamed the product Eddie's Pie in 2020, acknowledging directly that Eskimo is an outdated, externally imposed term for Inuit and Yupik peoples, who have always had and use their own specific names for themselves. One more small example of a piece of ice cream's own history quietly needing its own honest correction. A full century after the fact. It's a genuinely striking pattern, worth noticing, that three of America's most beloved frozen novelties, the popsicle, the good humor bar, and the Eskimo pie, all trace back to independent, unconnected inventors working within roughly the same 5-year window in the early 1920s. None of them copied each other. Each simply arrived through their own particular combination of accident, family suggestion, and patient experimentation at some version of the same basic, obvious idea that ice cream might taste even better and travel considerably more easily once it had a handle attached. Bert outfitted a fleet of 12 delivery trucks with rudimentary onboard freezers to sell his new invention directly through Youngstown's residential neighborhoods. And in a small, genuinely delightful detail worth holding onto, the very first bells mounted on those trucks, specifically chosen to announce each truck's arrival to nearby children, came from his own son's old bobsled. That distinctive chime, borrowed from a piece of forgotten childhood sporting equipment, would go on to become one of the most recognizable sounds in 20th century American neighborhoods. The good humor man's arrival announced, for decades afterward, by a bell that had begun its own life, doing something else entirely. The good humor man himself became a genuinely beloved fixture of American childhood for decades, following Bert's original 1920 invention. His crisp white uniform, deliberately chosen according to the company's own later account, specifically to project a wholesome, trustworthy cleanliness at a time when food safety standards were still considerably less reliable than they are today. By the 1950s, Good Humor operated a fleet numbering in the thousands of trucks across the country, and competing companies quickly developed their own versions of essentially the same basic idea, each developing its own distinct jingle or bell pattern to help children distinguish one approaching truck from another. Generations of American children grew up learning to recognize that particular bell as a genuine, reliable signal that something wonderful was about to arrive on their own street, often dropping whatever game or chore currently held their attention the moment they heard it. Take a moment, if you're still with us, to actually picture that particular sound reaching you now, wherever tonight happens to find you. A faint, familiar bell rounding some distant corner, growing slowly, unmistakably closer. The specific, unhurried anticipation of knowing exactly what's coming and simply waiting patiently for it to arrive. It's a genuinely small thing to carry into sleep tonight, but a real one that a bell borrowed from a child's own forgotten bobsled ended up becoming one of the most reliably comforting sounds an entire generation of American children ever learned to recognize. The ice cream cone's own origin story is one of the more genuinely contested in this entire subject, and it's worth walking through carefully, since the sheer number of competing claimants is remarkable. Popular tradition most commonly credits the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, where a Syrian immigrant named Ernest-Hamwi is said to have been selling a thin, crisp, waffle-like pastry called Zaliachbia at a booth next to an ice cream vendor who ran out of serving dishes on a hot, crowded day. According to the story, Hamwi rolled one of his pastries into a cone shape on the spot, handed it to the desperate vendor, and the combination proved instantly popular. Historian Anne Funderburg, whose detailed research specifically traces the cone's documented history, has identified at least 7 separate, genuinely competing origin accounts from this same 1904 World's Fair alone, crediting not only Hamwi, but also Ibdo Omar, brothers Nick and Albert Kabas, David Avawayoo, and Ohio concessionaire Charles Emienches, each with their own specific version of essentially the same basic story. Funderburg's research found no contemporary evidence from 1904 itself supporting any single one of these accounts over the others, meaning every version we have today was actually recorded considerably later, once the cone had already become popular enough that multiple people apparently wanted credit for it. More significantly still, the ice cream cone very likely predates the 1904 World's Fair by a considerable margin, regardless of which vendor's story turns out to hold any truth. An Italian immigrant confectioner named Italo Marchiochni was granted an American patent in December of 1903, several months before the St. Louis Fair even opened, for a mold specifically designed to produce edible cups meant to hold ice cream, and Marchiochni himself later testified he had been selling ice cream this way in New York City since as early as 1896. Even earlier still, ice cream historian Robin Weir has pointed to an 1807 etching of a fashionable Parisian cafe showing what appears to be a woman eating ice cream from a small hand-held, cone-shaped container. The honest, careful conclusion here is simply that nobody actually knows who first served ice cream in an edible cone, and the idea most likely developed independently, more than once, in more than one place, long before any single dramatic afternoon supposedly settled the matter. It's a useful lesson worth carrying forward. Popular history tends to prefer a single dramatic origin moment, one clever person, one specific afternoon, because that's simply a more satisfying story to tell. Actual historical evidence, examined carefully, almost always turns out messier. Several people arriving independently at similar solutions to the same obvious problem, spread out gradually across years, rather than settled in one tidy moment. Whoever actually deserves the credit, the edible cone's practical effect on ice cream's own retail history, was genuinely significant, considerably more than its charming origin stories usually acknowledge. A cone meant no dish to wash, no glass to return and reuse, nothing left behind at all once the treat itself was finished, since the container simply became part of what was eaten. That single small convenience helped make ice cream a genuinely mobile, single-handed, walk-and-eat kind of food for the very first time, freeing it from the sit-down parlor counter and sending it out onto sidewalks, boardwalks, and fairgrounds in a way a bowl and spoon never quite allowed. The ice cream sundae's origin follows an almost identical pattern. The most commonly repeated story involves so-called blue laws, local ordinances restricting certain commercial activities on Sundays, which in various American towns during the late 1800 reportedly banned the sale of ice cream sodas specifically, since the carbonated water used in a proper soda counted, in some local view, as an inappropriately festive indulgence for the Sabbath. According to the popular version, soda fountain operators worked around the restriction by serving ice cream with syrup, but no carbonated water. And this modified treat eventually became known as a sundae, its spelling deliberately altered from the day of the week. Several American towns, including Two Rivers in Wisconsin, Ithaca in New York, and Evanston in Illinois, have each separately confidently claimed to be the Sunday's true birthplace, each with its own specific local version of the Blue Law story and its own specific credited inventor. No single account has ever been definitively confirmed over the others by contemporary documentary evidence, and food historians studying the question generally treat the entire cluster of competing claims with the same careful skepticism we've applied throughout tonight. Genuinely uncertain territory, several plausible stories, and no single piece of evidence solid enough to settle the matter one way or another. Two Rivers, Wisconsin has, over the following century, leaned into its own claim with genuine civic enthusiasm, maintaining a small museum and periodic public celebrations around the town's self-declared status as the Sunday's true birthplace. It's a light-hearted, harmless kind of civic pride worth appreciating on its own terms, even while holding the underlying historical claim itself with the same gentle skepticism we've applied to nearly everything else tonight. A town choosing to organize part of its own identity around a story that happens to be charming, regardless of whether it happens to be strictly, provably true. When Burt Baskin and Irv Robbins merged their separately established California ice cream businesses in 1953, they settled on offering 31 distinct flavors specifically, one for every day of a typical month. A genuinely clever piece of branding built around the idea that a customer could theoretically try a different flavor every single day without ever repeating themselves. The specific number mattered less than the underlying message. It was designed to communicate abundance, variety, and a genuine sense of ongoing discovery, qualities considerably harder to build a lasting brand identity around using a single, fixed flavor alone. Baskin and Robbins had actually operated their two shops separately for several years before formally merging, each testing his own particular flavor and marketing ideas independently before deciding a combined 31 flavor operation would outperform either business running alone. It's a genuinely instructive small case study in franchise expansion, the specific number becoming so central to the brand's identity that 31 flavors eventually functioned almost as a second company name in its own right, recognizable to generations of American customers who may never have actually counted the tubs themselves. The Great Depression, difficult as it genuinely was for the wider ice cream industry, still managed to produce one of its most enduringly popular flavors. In 1929, California ice cream makers William D.R. Wire and Joseph E.E.D. developed a new flavor, combining chocolate ice cream with marshmallows and chopped walnuts, naming it Rocky Road specifically, according to the most consistently repeated account. give struggling customers something to smile about during an increasingly difficult economic period. A small, deliberate joke about the country's own rocky road ahead. Rocky Road remains, nearly a century later, one of the most consistently popular ice cream flavors in the country. A genuinely rare example of a specific flavor invention we can trace with real confidence back to two named individuals and a specific, well-documented moment. Other beloved flavors carry their own smaller, similarly specific stories worth a brief mention. Mint chocolate chip traces back to a 1973 English wedding where a bride specifically requested a mint chocolate ice cream be served at her reception, prompting a caterer to invent, essentially on commission, the specific flavor combination that would later spread across the Atlantic and become a permanent fixture of American ice cream counters. Cookie dough ice cream followed a considerably more grassroots path, credited to a Ben and Jerry's customer suggestion box request in the 1980, a genuinely rare instance of an entire now standard flavor category originating not from a professional confectioner at all, but from an ordinary customer simply writing down what they actually wanted. Ice cream's place within American identity became formally official during the Second World War, when military leadership came to treat it as something considerably more significant than a simple treat, a genuine, deliberate tool for maintaining troop morale. The effort reached a remarkable peak in 1945, when the Navy commissioned the conversion of a concrete barge into a floating ice cream production facility capable of manufacturing an estimated 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, specifically to supply ships operating in the Pacific Theater, where no other reliable source existed. The barge cost the Navy close to $1 million, a considerable wartime expense military leadership nonetheless judged worthwhile. That single dedicated barge wasn't actually the war's very first attempt at solving this same problem. Worth knowing before we move past it, individual ships and shore stations across the Pacific had already been improvising their own small-scale ice cream freezers for years by 1945, cobbled together from spare mechanical parts by crews determined not to go without. Official Navy accounts of the period noting the practice with a certain fond, indulgent tolerance rather than any real discouragement. The $1 million barge, seen in that light, was really just the military finally formally catching up to a demand its own sailors had already been quietly meeting for themselves. Picture the scene that barge would have actually created. Somewhere in the vast, humid heat of the Pacific, sailors and marines who had spent considerable stretches of time in genuinely difficult, dangerous conditions, receiving, delivered by a converted concrete barge built specifically for this exact purpose. The same simple, cold comfort their own families back home might have been enjoying on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. It's a genuinely strange, moving image to sit with. An entire branch of the United States military judging that a considerable wartime investment in soft serve production capacity was, given everything else happening around it, still genuinely worth making. This same wartime association carried directly forward into the Cold War, where ice cream took on an additional symbolic role, standing in for American abundance in direct, deliberate contrast to the shortages more commonly associated with the Soviet economic system. Television advertising, arriving as a genuinely new mass medium in American homes across this same post-war decade, found ice cream an unusually natural fit for its own particular strengths. A product that photographed beautifully, melted appealingly on camera, and lent itself easily to a catchy, hummable jingle. Brands competed increasingly on personality rather than substance alone during this period. Memorable mascots, distinctive truck bells, recognizable packaging, each one working to become the specific version of cold and sweet a given family reached for automatically, without necessarily stopping to think about why. Mechanical refrigeration developed and gradually commercialized across the late 1800 and early 1900, eventually freed ice cream production entirely from its long dependence on natural or artificially salted ice. This same technology eventually made possible one further innovation worth understanding, and it raises, fittingly, exactly the same kind of contested origin question we've already worked through twice tonight. Two American companies, Dairy Queen and Carvel, have each maintained their own confident, competing claim to having invented soft serve ice cream. And much like the sundae and the cone before it, the honest historical record doesn't clearly favor either version. Dairy Queen traces its account back to 1938, when J.F. McCullough and his son Alex reportedly convinced a friend running an ice cream shop in Kankakee, Illinois, to offer a soft, freshly churned version of their existing product for a single trial day, selling a genuinely surprising 1,600 servings within just a few hours. Carvel's founder, Tom Carvel, claimed a similar but entirely separate 1934 origin story involving a broken-down mobile ice cream truck in New York, whose melting cargo he supposedly decided to sell soft rather than lose entirely. Both accounts rely primarily on each company's own later retelling, rather than independent contemporary documentation, and food historians generally decline to award clear priority to either version. By the 1950s, ice cream had woven itself thoroughly into an entirely new piece of American culture: the drive-in restaurant, where car hops delivered milkshakes and sundaes directly to waiting automobiles, and the soft serve cone became a genuine fixture of teenage weekend social life across the entire country. Regional American variations quietly developed their own loyal followings during this same broad stretch of the 20th century. Worth a brief detour before we continue. Frozen custard, distinguished from standard soft serve mainly by a meaningfully higher egg yolk content and a denser, richer result, became a particular point of civic pride across the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin and Missouri, where St. Louis still credits its own 1904 World's Fair with popularizing the treat alongside the cone controversy we just spent time with. New England, for its part, developed a lasting fondness for milkshakes made with genuine hard ice cream, rather than the thinner soft serve base more common elsewhere in the country. A small but genuinely stubborn regional distinction New England shop owners still insist on defending today. One further modern chapter belongs in tonight's collection, and it involves a genuinely deliberate act of branding fiction, openly acknowledged decades later by the company itself. Haagen-Dazs, now one of the most recognized premium ice cream brands in the world, was founded in the Bronx, New York, in 1961 by Reuben and Rose Matias, an American couple with absolutely no Scandinavian heritage or connection whatsoever. The brand's distinctive, faintly Danish-sounding name was invented entirely from scratch, chosen deliberately because it sounded vaguely European and vaguely premium, evoking an imagined old-world tradition of dairy craftsmanship that never actually existed anywhere outside the Mattis family's own considered marketing strategy. The name itself isn't a real word in any actual language, Danish included, and even includes an umlaut mark over the specifically to enhance its foreign, sophisticated appearance, despite Danish not actually using that particular mark at all. It proved, by any reasonable measure, a genuinely brilliant piece of invented storytelling, successfully persuading generations of customers they were purchasing a treat with deep old world roots, when the entire premise had actually been dreamed up in a New York borough less than a lifetime ago. Even Hedge&Az, whose entire brand identity rested on an invented European heritage, was founded by the American-born children of Polish Jewish immigrants, reaching, in their own way, for an imagined old-world authenticity, their own family's actual immigrant story never quite provided them. It's a fitting entry in tonight's long list of confidently told, unverified origin stories. Except this one, unlike Marco Polo, was invented quite deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Hedge&Az's success didn't go unnoticed by its own competitors either. Several other American premium ice cream brands launched in the following decades with their own vaguely European-sounding invented names and old-world-styled packaging, a small, self-aware genre of marketing fiction that essentially became its own accepted industry convention. Customers and competitors alike understanding, on some level, that sounds European had simply become shorthand for premium, regardless of whether any actual European connection existed behind it at all. A very different kind of ice cream company took shape in 1978 when childhood friends Ben Cohn and Jerry Greenfield, having completed a $5 correspondence course in ice cream making through Pennsylvania State University, opened a small scoop shop in a converted gas station in Burlington, Vermont. Ben and Jerry's built its own considerable success on a genuinely different model than the large-scale industry we've traced throughout most of tonight, emphasizing chunky, deliberately imperfect mix-ins and a considered, folksy brand identity that stood in genuine contrast to the more polished corporate marketing that had dominated mid-century American ice cream. Its success helped inspire a considerably wider super premium movement during the 1980s and 90s. Ben and Jerry's own naming conventions, playful puns, and references to musicians, pop culture, and social causes the founders genuinely cared about, became almost as recognizable as the ice cream itself. A considered departure from the more restrained, purely descriptive flavor names most established competitors still favored. It reflected something the company was fairly explicit about from early on, that the personality behind a product could matter just as much to customers as the product's own basic quality. A lesson the wider premium food industry would spend the following decades absorbing in its own various ways. It's worth spending real time with vanilla, since it remains the most popular ice cream flavor worldwide, despite a somewhat unfair modern reputation for being the plain, unadventurous default. The vanilla orchid is native to Mexico, where a specific local bee species serves as its only natural pollinator, meaning genuine vanilla could originally only be reliably grown in this one specific region, making it a rare, expensive luxury anywhere else on Earth. That changed because of a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmond Albius, living on the French colonial island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean, who in 1841 discovered a genuinely ingenious hand-pollination technique. Before Albius's discovery, vanilla's scarcity had made it genuinely precious across Europe, priced closer to a fine spice or a small luxury import than an everyday flavoring, available almost exclusively to the wealthiest households and reserved for the most special occasions. It's worth holding that image alongside the flavor's now thoroughly ordinary status, sitting in nearly every freezer and grocery aisle on Earth, since it makes Albius's own quiet, patient discovery considerably easier to properly appreciate. A single technique worked out by a child, responsible for transforming one of the rarest flavors in the world into its single most common one. Using a simple thin stick and his own thumb, Albius transferred pollen between the orchid's delicate flower parts, successfully mimicking the pollination process the absent Mexican bee had always handled naturally. His technique, straightforward once discovered, but requiring real skill to perform correctly on each individual flower, made commercial vanilla cultivation genuinely possible for the first time anywhere outside Mexico. Réunion and neighboring Madagascar rapidly became, and largely remain today, the world's dominant vanilla-growing regions, producing the overwhelming majority of the world's vanilla supply, using essentially the same hand-pollination method Albius worked out as a child, still performed by hand, one flower at a time, since no reliable mechanical alternative has ever been developed. Albius himself despite the genuinely enormous economic value his discovery eventually created across the entire global vanilla industry, received no meaningful financial benefit from it during his own lifetime, gaining his freedom from slavery only in 1848, when France finally abolished the practice across its colonial territories, and dying in genuine poverty in 1880. His specific contribution only gradually, belatedly recognized long after his own death. Vanilla's genuine, enduring popularity as the world's favorite ice cream flavor rests directly, entirely, on a technique one enslaved child worked out through his own patient ingenuity. A debt the wider world has still, by most honest measures, never remotely finished properly repaying. Consider for a moment just how directly Albius's own childhood technique still shapes vanilla's price and availability today, nearly 2 centuries later, because every single vanilla flower still requires that same careful, individual hand-pollination within a narrow window of just a few hours after it opens. A poor harvest season or a damaging storm across Madagascar can send global vanilla prices swinging dramatically within a single year. A genuinely rare case of an entire worldwide market still resting this directly on one specific, unmechanized piece of manual human skill, performed flower by flower, exactly the way a 12-year-old boy first worked it out on a French colonial plantation in 1841. It's worth pausing to understand exactly why ice cream ends up with its particular smooth, scoopable texture, rather than simply freezing into a solid block of flavored ice. The answer involves a concept called overrun, referring to the volume of air deliberately incorporated during churning. As a cream mixture freezes while being continuously agitated, tiny ice crystals form throughout the liquid, and the constant motion prevents those crystals from growing large enough to feel gritty on the tongue, while simultaneously whipping a controlled amount of air directly into the mixture. Commercial ice cream typically contains between 25 and 50% air by volume, directly shaping both its texture. And since air is considerably cheaper than cream, its final manufacturing cost. Commercial manufacturers also rely on small quantities of stabilizers, often derived from guar gum, locust bean gum, or carrageenan, extracted from seaweed, to help keep that carefully whipped texture stable across weeks or months of storage. slowing the gradual regrowth of ice crystals that would otherwise occur every time a carton warms slightly and refreezes inside a home freezer. It's the same basic goal Nancy Johnson's Dasher was already chasing back in 1843, preventing ice crystals from growing large enough to notice, simply extended now across a considerably longer shelf life than any 19th century household would have ever actually needed to manage. That same sudden, sharp headache that arrives when you eat ice cream too quickly has a real, well-understood physiological explanation worth knowing. When something very cold touches the roof of your mouth, the sudden temperature change causes blood vessels there to rapidly constrict, and then just as rapidly dilate again. And because nerves in the roof of your mouth share a pathway with nerves connected to your forehead, your brain briefly, mistakenly interprets this sudden vascular change as pain originating from your forehead rather than your mouth, a phenomenon researchers call referred pain. The sensation typically resolves within less than a minute on its own, and the simplest remedy remains pressing your tongue firmly against the roof of your mouth, warming the area back up considerably faster than simply waiting it out. Once ice cream had conquered America so thoroughly, what happened everywhere else that had already been freezing sweetened things long before Europeans ever ate a proper dairy ice at all? Italian gelato, made using techniques directly descended from the same broad tradition we traced earlier tonight, typically contains considerably less butterfat and considerably less incorporated air than standard American ice cream, churned at a slower speed and served slightly warmer than typical American storage temperatures. This produces a denser, more intensely flavored result that Italian confectioners consider genuinely, meaningfully distinct from ice cream, as most Americans understand the word, the same basic Renaissance era technique, simply refined and preserved with less air folded into the final product. Gelato's distinctive presentation, mounted high and swirled in shallow metal tins rather than scooped from a deep tub, is itself a deliberate practical choice, worth noticing next time you happen to see it. That shallower depth allows the denser, lower overrun mixture to be served at a slightly warmer temperature without collapsing into a puddle, keeping its full flavor more immediately accessible on the tongue than a harder frozen American scoop, straight from a much colder standard freezer case, generally allows. In South Asia, kulfi represents an entirely separately developed frozen dairy tradition, made by slowly simmering milk for hours until it reduces and thickens considerably, then freezing the concentrated result, traditionally in small sealed metal cones submerged directly in an ice and salt mixture, without the continuous churning that defines Western ice cream production. Because KULF isn't churned the same way, it lacks the same airy overrun we discussed earlier tonight, resulting in a noticeably denser, chewier texture, often flavored with cardamom, saffron, pistachio, or mango, reflecting culinary traditions that developed largely independently of the European history we've spent most of tonight following. Turkish dondurma offers a genuinely distinctive textural experience, made using a natural thickening ingredient called enslaved-adjacent, ground from the tubers of a wild orchid species, combined with mastic, a resin harvested from a particular Mediterranean tree. This produces an ice cream with a famously elastic, taffy-like stretch and a notably slow melting time, a texture skilled dondurma vendors often incorporate directly into a playful theatrical serving style, teasing and stretching the treat before finally handing it over to an amused customer. It's one more independent solution to the exact same basic problem. Keeping something cold genuinely delightful rather than merely cold. The enslaved, used to achieve that particular stretch, comes from a wild orchid species, now genuinely threatened by overharvesting in parts of Turkey and Iran. Since each plant must be dug up entirely to reach the small tuber the ingredient is made from, and a single plant takes years to mature. Some producers have responded by turning to cultivated enslaved sources or partial substitutes instead. One more small, quiet example of an old culinary tradition having to adapt its own methods to protect the very ingredient that made it distinctive in the first place. In Japan, mochi ice cream wraps a small sphere of ice cream inside a thin, chewy layer of pounded rice dough, combining a considerably older Japanese confectionery tradition with a considerably more recent frozen dessert. This genuinely successful modern fusion was first commercially developed and popularized in the United States during the 1980 by Frances Hashimoto, a Japanese-American businesswoman whose own family had run a traditional Japanese confectionery business in Los Angeles for generations, before she recognized an opportunity to combine two beloved treats that had, until that point, always been kept entirely separate. In Iran, Fa'al Day offers a genuinely direct living link back to the very beginning of tonight's entire story. A dessert made from thin, frozen, vermicelli-like rice noodles combined with rose water and sometimes lime syrup, a direct descendant of exactly the same Persian ice and fruit tradition we began tonight with. It's still prepared and enjoyed today in largely the same essential spirit as the yakshal-cooled treats wealthy Persian households were already savoring well over 2,000 years before anyone in Europe had any comparable frozen dessert of their own at all. A genuinely remarkable continuity stretching all the way from ancient Persia to tonight's own dinner tables. In the Philippines, sorbietes, sometimes affectionately nicknamed dirty ice cream, for its humble street cart origins rather than any actual concern about cleanliness, is traditionally churned using coconut or carabao milk rather than standard cow's dairy, hand-cranked by vendors peddling small carts through neighborhood streets and calling out to announce their arrival, not entirely unlike the good humor man's own bell a world away. In Mexico, paellitas take a different approach entirely. Fresh fruit, milk, or cream, frozen directly onto a wooden stick without any churning at all, producing a bright, intensely flavored treat sold from colorful pushcarts across countless towns and cities. A direct, unbroken cousin of Frank E. Pearson's own accidental porch discovery, arrived at independently by an entirely different culinary tradition. The familiar tricolor arrangement many of us know as Neapolitan ice cream, chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry, presented together in neat, separate stripes, traces its origin to Italian immigrants arriving in the United States during the late 1800, who brought with them a genuine culinary tradition from Naples of serving several distinct flavors together, deliberately evoking the colors of the Italian flag itself. American manufacturers gradually standardized the specific combination we recognize today, in part because these three flavors could be produced using broadly similar base ingredients, making the tricolor block considerably easier and more economical to manufacture at genuine commercial scale. Chocolate's own path to becoming ice cream's second most popular flavor worldwide traces back to cacao's original domestication in Mesoamerica, where it was consumed as a bitter, spiced drink for centuries before European colonization gradually transformed it through sugar and eventually milk into the sweeter substance most of the world associates with the word today. Chocolate ice cream appears in documented European and American recipes by the mid-1700s. Not far behind vanilla's own earliest confirmed appearances, and it settled early into its now familiar position as the natural companion flavor, anchoring the Neapolitan tradition we just discussed. Strawberry, rounding out the classic trio, arrived somewhat later to widespread popularity than either companion flavor, since reliable, affordable access to genuinely ripe strawberries remained considerably more seasonal and regionally limited than vanilla extract or cacao, both of which could be dried and shipped considerably more easily across long distances. Strawberry ice cream became genuinely widespread only once improved and eventually refrigerated shipping developed across the second half of the 1800s, allowed fresh and preserved strawberries to reach manufacturers reliably outside their own immediate local growing season. Ice cream's history, once again directly tracking right alongside the broader history of food preservation and transportation. Well before ice cream trucks and drugstore soda fountains became fixtures of American community life, an earlier tradition called the ice cream social had already established the treat as something specifically associated with gathering and celebration. Church congregations and small-town communities across 19th century America regularly organized these events, often as fundraisers, bringing neighbors together to hand-crank freezers and share homemade ice cream on a pleasant summer evening. It required no particular wealth or special occasion to justify, simply the shared, communal effort of making something cold and sweet together, and then sitting down to properly enjoy it. Ice cream reached many American city streets through a considerably humbler channel worth remembering honestly tonight. Italian immigrants arriving in cities, including New York, during the late 1800s, frequently worked as street vendors, pushing small handcarts through crowded neighborhoods and selling penny-sized portions of ice cream, sometimes served in small reusable glass cups nicknamed penny licks, which customers would lick clean and return directly to the vendor, a practice public health officials eventually banned once they recognized the genuine disease risk in passing the same unwashed glass between dozens of customers in a single afternoon. that specific public health concern, worth noting, is one more small thread quietly connecting back to the edible cone story. We spent considerable time with earlier tonight. Once disposable paper and edible cones became more widely available and affordable, they offered street vendors a genuinely practical solution to exactly the penny-lick problem officials were increasingly worried about. A single-use container requiring no washing, no returning, and no risk of spreading illness between one customer and the next. Many of these same vendors worked under a difficult arrangement called the padrone system, in which an established intermediary controlled access to carts, ice, and selling routes in exchange for a substantial cut of each vendor's modest daily earnings. It was a genuinely exploitative labor structure that nonetheless represented, for many newly arrived immigrant families with few other economic options, one of the only accessible paths toward eventually building something of their own. It's worth remembering, alongside the more famous names in tonight's story, just how much of ice cream's actual spread depended on exactly this kind of difficult, largely invisible immigrant labor. It's worth pausing honestly on one further chapter of ice cream's American story. For a considerable stretch of the 20th century, particularly across the American South, soda fountains and ice cream parlors were racially segregated, with black customers frequently barred from sitting at the counter at all, even at establishments otherwise happy to sell them the very same products. This ordinary, everyday counter eventually became one of the civil rights movement's most significant sites of peaceful protest. When 4 black college students sat down at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, in February of 1960, and simply asked to be served a quiet act of dignity that spread within weeks to dozens of other cities across the South. It's a genuinely important part of the fuller, honest history behind a treat we mostly associate with simple, uncomplicated pleasure. Within months of that Greensboro protest, similar sit-ins had spread to more than 50 cities across the South, and within a few years, many of the very lunch counters where the protests began had, under sustained public pressure, finally integrated their service. It's worth sitting with that particular shape of change for a moment. That a genuine civil rights milestone unfolded not at a courthouse or a Capitol building, but at the same kind of ordinary counter where someone might otherwise simply be deciding between chocolate and vanilla, a reminder that the most everyday spaces in a society are very often exactly where its deepest injustices and its most meaningful corrections actually play out. In recent decades, a genuinely significant craft and artisanal ice cream movement has grown alongside the large industrial manufacturers who still dominate most of the overall global market. Small batch producers deliberately emphasizing locally sourced dairy, unusual seasonal flavor combinations, and considerably lower overrun than mass market brands typically use, producing a denser, more deliberately crafted product. It echoes, in its own modern way, the same careful, small batch approach confectioners like Augustus Jackson were already practicing well over a century and a half earlier, long before industrial scale manufacturing made speed and volume the industry's dominant priority. This same movement has also revived something considerably less technical, but arguably just as important: the small, independent, owner-operated shop as a genuine neighborhood fixture, a place where a specific person, rather than a distant corporation, is personally responsible for what ends up in the freezer case. It's worth noticing how directly that particular model echoes tonight's very earliest chapters. A single skilled maker working close to their own community, offering something considerably more personal than what any large-scale operation could realistically manage. The same basic relationship between confectioner and customer that Augustus Jackson and Francesco Procopio would likely have found entirely familiar. Ice cream has developed increasingly formal accommodation for various religious dietary requirements in more recent decades, with kosher certification confirming a given product meets Jewish dietary law, including careful attention to how dairy ingredients are sourced and processed, and halal certification, providing similar assurance for Muslim consumers regarding ingredient sourcing and production methods. This kind of formal certification represents a genuinely practical, modern extension of ice cream's much longer history of adaptation. The same basic treat continuing to find new ways to remain genuinely accessible across an increasingly wide range of different communities. It's worth acknowledging one further genuinely modern chapter to this long story, since it reflects a real, active concern within the industry today. Dairy production carries a genuinely significant environmental footprint, and ice cream manufacturers, alongside the broader dairy industry, have faced increasing scrutiny in recent years regarding water usage, land use, and greenhouse gas emissions associated with large-scale dairy farming. Some manufacturers have responded with genuine investment in more sustainable sourcing practices and continued expansion of plant-based alternatives, while researchers continue studying exactly how significant these various interventions actually prove to be at meaningful scale. Agricultural scientists have also begun studying how rising average temperatures might affect dairy cattle themselves in coming decades, since heat stress measurably reduces milk yield and quality in traditional dairy breeds, prompting genuine research interest in heat-tolerant cattle varieties and adjusted farming practices in regions expecting a meaningfully warmer future. It's a fittingly circular concern for tonight's whole story to end up touching on. A treat originally perfected specifically to survive heat, now facing a version of that same fundamental challenge from an entirely different, considerably more modern direction. A considerable share of the world's adult population is lactose intolerant, lacking the digestive enzyme needed to properly break down the natural sugar found in dairy milk, a condition considerably more common in certain populations, including many people of Asian, African, and indigenous American descent, than in populations of primarily Northern European ancestry, beginning in earnest during the 1980 and expanding considerably since manufacturers have developed increasingly sophisticated non-dairy alternatives built from soy, almond, coconut, and more recently oat milk bases, each requiring careful reformulation to achieve a texture genuinely comparable to traditional dairy ice cream. There's a genuinely fitting modern echo worth including tonight, since it carries us all the way back, geographically at least, to the same basic relationship between ice and pleasure we began with. Researchers stationed at various Antarctic research bases, including the American McMurdo Station, have long maintained an informal but genuinely well-documented tradition of making their own ice cream on site, sometimes even carrying a freshly churned batch outside briefly into the extreme surrounding cold, specifically to watch it firm up even further within moments. A small, cheerful ritual performed by scientists working in one of the most inhospitable environments on the entire planet. There's something quietly moving about that particular tradition, worth sitting with for a moment. Scientists stationed thousands of miles from any grocery store, surrounded by more genuine, ambient cold than almost anywhere else on Earth, still choose, entirely voluntarily, to spend their own limited free time recreating exactly the same simple pleasure Persian nobility once savored beside a mud brick tower 2,500 years earlier. It suggests something worth carrying gently into sleep tonight, that the appeal at the center of all this was never really about scarcity or convenience at all. It was always, underneath everything else, simply about the pleasure itself, sought out and recreated by people even when circumstance and an entire continent of ice offered them every possible reason not to bother. One more small, genuinely popular piece of ice cream mythology deserves honest treatment before we continue, since it's likely sitting in a novelty shop near you right now. Freeze-dried astronaut ice cream, the crumbly, foil-wrapped block many of us encountered as children, is commonly believed to be a genuine, regular part of American astronauts' actual diet in space. The real story is considerably more limited. Freeze-dried ice cream did fly aboard at least one early NASA mission as an experimental novelty rather than an ongoing staple. And most astronauts who have publicly commented on the product describe it as a curiosity rather than something regularly eaten during actual missions. Its continued, genuinely enormous popularity in gift shops and science museums today rests considerably more on its novelty and clever branding than on its ongoing status as authentic astronaut cuisine. One more example of a genuinely appealing story proving considerably more durable and more widely believed than the actual, more modest documented facts underneath it. It's worth including one small official piece of American ice cream history before we continue much further, since it reflects just how thoroughly the treat had become woven into national identity by the late 20th century. In July of 1984, President Ronald Reagan issued a formal presidential proclamation designating July as National Ice Cream Month, and the third Sunday of that same month as National Ice Cream Day, citing the treat's genuine, long-standing popularity across the entire country. It stands as a genuinely fitting, if slightly whimsical, formal acknowledgement of everything we've traced tonight. Today, the global ice cream market represents a genuinely enormous economic sector, valued at tens of billions of dollars annually, and continuing to grow steadily across nearly every region of the world, with New Zealand, the United States, and Australia consistently ranking among the highest per capita consuming nations. Psychologists studying food and memory have found that taste and smell are unusually powerful triggers for detailed, emotionally vivid recollection, more so than almost any other sense. Since the brain's processing pathways for smell connect unusually directly to regions associated with memory and emotion. This helps explain why a single bite of a particular ice cream flavor can summon an entire half-forgotten childhood afternoon back into vivid focus. A specific porch, a specific person, recalled with a clarity that seems almost disproportionate to something as simple as flavored frozen cream. The word ice cream itself appears to have entered common English usage sometime during the mid-1700s, gradually replacing an earlier, more cumbersome phrase, iced cream, as the treat became familiar enough that a shorter name felt natural. Other languages developed their own distinct terms along broadly similar lines. The French crème glacée, the Italian gelato, itself simply the Italian word for frozen, and the German Eis, a considerably more compact word doing double duty for both the treat itself and the simple, ordinary substance that made the whole thing possible in the first place. Guinness World Records has tracked numerous ice cream-related achievements over the years, including the largest ice cream sundae ever assembled, weighing in at well over 20 tons when a group in Edmonton, Canada, built one in 1988, and various records for the largest simultaneous ice cream social gatherings, sometimes drawing thousands of participants scooping and sharing ice cream together in a single coordinated public event. These modern records feel, in their own genuinely playful way, like a distant echo of exactly the same communal ice cream social tradition 19th century American towns had already established, simply scaled up considerably further than any single church fundraiser ever could have managed. There's one final pattern worth naming clearly, since it quietly threads through an enormous share of tonight's actual documented history, once you know to look for it. Francesco Procopio, who opened Europe's first genuinely famous ice cream cafe, was a Sicilian immigrant to Paris. Italo Marchioechny, who patented an early ice cream cone mold years before the more famous World's Fair stories, was an Italian immigrant to New York. Ernest HAMWE, whichever exact version of the cone story eventually holds the most truth, was a Syrian immigrant selling pastries at a fair in a country not yet fully his own. Ice cream's real history, in other words, is genuinely, substantially an immigrant history, built disproportionately by people who arrived somewhere new, carrying whatever specific culinary knowledge their own home culture had already developed, and finding in a cold, sweet, genuinely universal treat one of the more reliable paths available to them toward building something of their own. The same pattern continued well beyond tonight's most famous names. Chinese, Greek, and Lebanese immigrant families opened a considerable share of the small, independent ice cream parlors and soda fountains that dotted American downtowns across the early and mid-20th century. Family-run businesses rarely remembered by any individual name today, but collectively responsible for making a proper ice cream counter a genuinely ordinary fixture of nearly every American main street, regardless of the town's own size or particular claim to any famous invention. It's worth pausing on one further small, genuinely telling detail. Robert Brantley, the same colonial Williamsburg researcher we met earlier tonight while working through the Marco Polo myth, has spent a genuinely considerable share of his own career patiently tracing exactly how these various ice cream legends first took root and spread, combing through 19th century advertisements and cookbook prefaces, specifically looking for the earliest point any given myth actually appears in print. His careful, patient work represents exactly the same kind of quiet, unglamorous historical labor worth celebrating tonight. Years of incremental checking and correcting, undertaken specifically so the rest of us might eventually hear a version of this story considerably closer to what actually happened. Brantley is far from alone in this particular kind of work. Culinary historians across several countries have spent recent decades applying exactly this same patient standard to food history more broadly. Not just ice cream, treating popular kitchen legends with the same careful scrutiny more traditional historians have long applied to political or military history. It's a genuinely useful reminder that the food sitting quietly in your own freezer or pantry tonight has very likely accumulated its own tangle of comfortable myths too, waiting, much like ice cream's own myths were, for someone patient enough to eventually go looking. It's worth understanding why this particular combination, cold and sweet together, seems to hold such remarkably consistent appeal across so many unconnected cultures and centuries. Researchers studying human taste and sensory response generally point to straightforward evolutionary factors. Sweetness has always signaled reliable, quickly usable caloric energy to the human body, an ancient preference that predates civilization entirely, while cold temperatures naturally dull and soften the intensity of sweetness on the tongue, allowing genuinely high sugar content to feel pleasant rather than cloying. Cold also slows the release of aromatic flavor compounds, meaning a well-made frozen dessert reveals its full flavor gradually. Across the entire time it takes to melt in the mouth, researchers studying infant taste preference have found that a liking for sweetness appears to be genuinely innate rather than learned, present in newborns within hours of birth, long before any cultural exposure could plausibly explain it, while a wariness toward bitter flavors, evolution's own rough proxy for potential poison, appears just as early and just as consistently across every human population studied. It helps explain something worth sitting with tonight, that ice cream's appeal was never really something any single culture invented or taught its children to enjoy. It was already waiting, quietly built into the basic wiring of the human palate, long before anyone in Persia or China or anywhere else ever thought to pour syrup over a bowl of shaved ice at all. Modern ice cream production has continued finding genuinely new techniques worth a brief mention. Liquid nitrogen, extremely cold, and typically used across various industrial and medical applications, has found its way into contemporary artisanal ice cream making as well. Since pouring it directly into a cream mixture freezes the entire batch almost instantly, producing exceptionally small ice crystals and a correspondingly smooth texture, a considerably faster and more dramatic modern echo of the same basic goal Nancy Johnson's hand-cranked dasher was already working toward back in 1843, freezing a mixture quickly enough that no single ice crystal ever gets the chance to grow large enough to feel gritty on the tongue. Modern high-end restaurants have, in recent decades, occasionally revived some of this same experimental, chemistry-driven spirit, chefs working in the style, sometimes called molecular gastronomy, using liquid nitrogen, unusual stabilizers, and precise temperature control to create ice creams with genuinely novel textures and presentations, a fitting modern echo of exactly the same basic curiosity that once drove the Arcadia del Chiamiento's careful Florentine experiments with salt and ice. There's a genuine showmanship to liquid nitrogen ice cream worth acknowledging honestly. The dramatic billowing vapor, the theatrical tableside preparation that echoes something else we've already encountered tonight too. The same basic instinct behind Frank E. Pearson's own reverse-engineered charm and Haagen-Dazs's own carefully invented mystique. A good story, or in this case, a good piece of dinner table spectacle, has always helped sell a dessert every bit as effectively as the dessert's own actual taste. A pattern apparently as durable as the treat itself. Modern manufacturers have also embraced genuinely experimental flavor combinations in recent years, incorporating savory ingredients, unusual spices, and locally specific regional ingredients that would have been entirely unfamiliar to nearly every historical figure we've encountered across tonight's entire journey. It's a reminder that even a treat with a documented history running back over 2,000 years continues finding genuinely new directions to explore. The same basic pleasure, cold and sweet, endlessly reinterpreted by whichever generation happens to be currently enjoying it. Food historians and archaeologists continue actively researching ice cream's own deep history. Even now, researchers studying ancient Chinese texts connected to the Tang Dynasty continue refining exactly what these early frozen dairy preparations actually contained. Since much of what survives comes through fragmentary written references rather than any preserved physical sample. Similarly, ongoing archival research into figures like Nancy Johnson and Augustus Jackson continues gradually filling in additional biographical detail neither had the opportunity, or perhaps simply the social standing, to properly preserve during their own lifetimes. It's a genuinely fitting note to sit with, that even a subject this seemingly complete, this thoroughly enjoyed by billions of people every year, still has real, honest gaps in its documented history. Gaps researchers continue patiently working to fill. One careful archival search at a time. Recent archival work, specifically on Augustus Jackson, has managed to locate additional city directory listings and tax records confirming the scale of his eventual Philadelphia business, even without ever recovering his own written recipes. Every small confirmation like this matters more than it might first appear, since it means a man history came remarkably close to losing almost entirely, remembered for decades, mostly through polite second-hand tradition rather than his own surviving words, keeps becoming, patiently and gradually, a slightly more solid, more genuinely documented presence in the historical record. With each new archive, someone finally takes the time to check. It's worth sitting with just how dramatic ice cream's own journey from genuine scarcity to genuine abundance actually was. For the vast majority of its documented history, stretching from those ancient Persian yak shawls all the way through Thomas Jefferson's carefully handwritten recipe, ice cream required real wealth, real access to carefully preserved natural ice, and real, considerable labor, whether that labor came from a servant, an enslaved person, or a genuinely exhausting hour spent personally turning a hand crank. It was, for essentially every century of its existence before the mid-1800, a luxury in the fullest, most literal sense. Consider, for a moment, exactly how many separate kinds of privilege once had to line up simultaneously just to produce a single bowl of it. A household needed enough wealth to own or hire a freezer and its ice supply. A city needed reliable commercial ice, which meant needing Tudor's shipping trade or a comparable local source. And someone, somewhere in that household, needed to actually perform the cold, exhausting labor of turning cream into cream, ice into something colder still. Remove any single one of those conditions, and the whole dessert simply didn't happen that day. And then, within the span of really just a single century, roughly 1840 to 1940, nearly every single barrier fell away almost at once. Nancy Johnson's mechanical dasher eliminated the worst of the manual labor. Jacob Fussell's wholesale model eliminated the worst of the cost. Frederick Teodor's ice trade eliminated the worst of the supply problem. Good Humor's trucks eliminated even the need to travel anywhere to get it. What had been, for over 2,000 years, a treat requiring genuine privilege simply to taste, became, within one comparatively brief historical stretch, something a child could reasonably expect to enjoy on any ordinary summer afternoon, purchased with pocket change from a truck driving directly to wherever that child happened to already be standing. It's worth sitting with just how unusually compressed that particular transformation actually was. compared to almost everything else we've traced tonight. 8,000 years, give or take, separated the first Persian ice tower from ice cream's earliest confirmed European dairy recipes. A single century, by comparison, was all it took to move from a hand-cranked household luxury to a nickel treat sold from a passing truck. Very few foods in human history have moved that quickly from genuine scarcity to genuine, casual abundance, and fewer still have done it while somehow keeping their essential character, cold, sweet, and simple, almost entirely unchanged the whole way through. It's worth remembering, too, that virtually none of tonight's featured inventors and confectioners ever tasted the finished result of their own work in quite the convenient way we can today, pulling a carton directly from a freezer that maintains a perfectly consistent temperature without any ongoing human effort at all. Augustus Jackson, Nancy Johnson, even Harry Burt, working in 1920, still depended on ice that had to be harvested, transported, and carefully managed by hand. The genuinely effortless convenience most of us now take completely for granted represents the final, considerably more recent chapter of a very long, very patient chain of accumulated invention. There's something worth sitting with in that particular hum. If your own kitchen happens to have one nearby tonight, a small machine working quietly and continuously in the dark, holding a temperature steady that once demanded an entire household's coordinated effort just to approximate for a single afternoon. It asks for nothing, complains about nothing, and simply keeps doing every single night what centuries of patient human ingenuity spent working out how to do at all. There's a particular, universally recognizable sensation worth pausing on for a moment. The first spoonful of a properly made ice cream, cold enough to feel like a genuine small shock against the tongue, giving way almost immediately into something soft, smooth, and slowly, gradually warming as it melts. That specific textural journey, hard resistance, softening into gentle surrender, is really the entire physical result of everything we've traced across tonight's whole story. The salt and ice discovery, the careful churning, the controlled overrun, all of it working together in the background of a single ordinary bite most of us have never once paused to properly notice. Let's return for a moment to that same basic Persian yak shawl we began tonight's journey with, since everything else we've covered is really just an elaborate, centuries-long series of improvements built directly on top of that same original simple idea. Keep ice cold. Mix it with something sweet. Share it with someone. Every single innovation across tonight's entire story, the salt and ice breakthrough, the hand-cranked dasher, the wholesale factory, the chocolate coating, the stick, the truck, and its borrowed bobsled bell. All of it exists purely in service of doing that same three-step process, a little more easily, a little more reliably, for a few more people than whoever came before had managed to. Picture, one more time, that original Persian tower standing quietly in the desert heat, its thick mud brick walls holding a winter's worth of mountain ice, safely through months most other structures anywhere nearby couldn't have managed at all. Somewhere inside it, ice that had fallen as snow many months earlier, carried down from distant mountains by people whose names were never recorded, waited patiently in the cool dark for someone to finally carry a portion of it out, shave it into a bowl, and pour rose water and fruit syrup gently over the top. That single, simple pleasure, cold and sweet together on the tongue, is really the whole of what we've spent tonight following, across 2,500 years, across Persia and China, and the Arab world, and Sicily, and Florence, and Paris, and Philadelphia, and a converted navy barge somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The same basic, simple delight, rediscovered and reinvented and refined by an enormous number of different people, most of them never given the credit that later, considerably more confident storytellers eventually handed to somebody else instead. We will likely never know the specific name of whoever first thought to pour honeyed syrup over shaved mountain ice inside one of those quiet Persian towers. We do know, with genuine confidence, considerably more about Augustus Jackson and Nancy Johnson and Frank E. Pierson and Harry Burt and Edmond Albius and Jacob Fussell, real people who each added their own genuine, documented piece to this same long, patient chain. Most of them remembered today, if they are remembered at all, considerably less prominently than the comfortable myths that grew up around them instead. And so we come gently to the end of tonight's long, cool journey. We've moved from a mud brick tower in the Persian desert to a converted navy barge in the middle of the Pacific, from a Renaissance scientific academy, carefully measuring salt and ice, to an 11-year-old boy's accidental discovery on a cold California porch. Along the way, we set aside a great many confident, comfortable myths and found, underneath nearly every single one of them, real people doing real, considerable work that mostly went unrecorded, uncredited, and eventually quietly replaced by whichever story happened to sell better. That's really the thread holding this whole night together, more than any single flavor or invention. The most confidently repeated stories aren't always the true ones, and the subjects that feel too small or too pleasant to bother questioning carefully are often exactly the ones most worth a closer, more patient look. If your mind is still drifting somewhere back there among mud brick towers and hand-cranked freezers and a bell borrowed from an old bobsled, that's all right. There's nothing left to hold onto tonight, nothing you need to remember for later. Let your jaw loosen one more time. Let your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you up. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last, the way a scoop of something cold and sweet slowly, gently softens once it's finally been left alone to rest. Sleep well.